Today I welcome professor and author Tim Lawrence to the Heartbeat of the Dance Floor. Tim and I met years ago when he was working on the book Life and Death on the New York Dance Floor, 1980 to 1983. I was already familiar with Tim's work from his previous book, Love Saves the Day, which chronicles the 1970s dance music culture, predominantly in New York City. Basically, the story of my first 4 years in New York City, having moved there in the fall of 1976. Since then, Tim has gone on to create a podcast series of his own called Love is the Message, as well as other endeavors, which I'll let him tell you all about. Tim, thank you for joining us all the way from London to be my very special guest on the Heartbeat of the Dance Floor. Welcome.
Thanks, Marsha. It's a pleasure to be here, all the way from London.
Indeed. And it's been too long since we've seen each other in
always.
In this new virtual world. It kind of makes distance non-exist. So I kind of do have a little bit of fondness for the Zoomy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let me open up, please. I gave you a brief introduction, but there's so much more. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself and what I find the perspective that you will bring to this table, to this discussion that's very fresh, is your positions as an educator and as a professor of pop culture, and how we've got historical implications in all the things we do, hopefully good ones.
Well, that's a big question. And I also don't really want to talk about myself, especially I'd rather talk about, Heartbeat and the dance floor and all the things that spring to mind when we talk about that. I suppose one thing I could say is that I think I grew up with a sense of, being drawn to rhythm. If I look back to the music that I was kind of really liked as a kid, I was, often drawn to, say, percussive breaks or what have you. They did something. They moved me moved me and my body in a certain way. These things are, of course, involuntary in some respects. I found meaning and solace in a very powerful way on the dance floor. In the aftermath of both my parents dying when I was still quite a young man. I was 20, 22 or 21 anyway, when my mum passed away. My dad had passed away 3 years earlier, and I wasn't doing too well psychologically. And I felt kind of, desolate and isolated. And I didn't have a long history at that point in going out dancing. But a friend had recently introduced me to rave culture that had its own dynamic, and I found very thrilling for a while. But then I found myself also drawn to a much more intimate space, an underground, literally kind of cellar, kind of basement style party. In what used to be called the Gardening Club in Covent Garden. It's now become the Apple Store. And there was a night there on Friday nights called Feel Real. And I was very new to the culture, but I was introduced there. I immediately fell in love with this place. It had a great kind of early 90s vibe. And the music that was coming in there really was mainly New York house music. The key kind of producer remixers at the time there were many, but Little Louie Vega and Kenny Dope Gonzalez going as masters at work. They seemed to bring their style of house music from that moment seemed to bring a kind of infinite potential to the music. It was kind of that house beat, that 4 on the floor bass beat, which was kind of at the center. But then it seemed that everything could be brought into that matrix. And Louie and Kenny were really, quite far developed in terms of developing that sort of aesthetic, bringing in soul and jazz and R&B and dub and Latin and African kind of, musical tropes and musical styles. So it seemed like there was this infinite potential. There was something about the music that had a very communal sensibility or helped generate a community. And in that space, which was also a space where there was a very good communication between the DJs and the dancers, and with the help of some MDMA or ecstasy, I was able to feel okay for a period, for a few hours, maybe even for 5 or 6 hours. And it was only on that floor at that moment that I felt that kind of things were all right. When I wasn't on the floor at that moment, I wasn't really so sure. And so this kind of, I think, a sort of indelible bond was established there and then. that gave me a sense that the dance floor was a place, obviously, where I could enjoy music and I could enjoy dancing, and I could even explore this this what was then still felt like a radical form of cultural expression. But above all, it was like what was important is how it made me feel, and it also is how it made me feel, not only being, well, I suppose in a situation where I wasn't with my closest friends. I was largely with people I didn't know. And yet there was an affinity, a sense of a bond, a sense of a
Sure.
community, which, although in some respects superficial, also felt very, very deep.
But for that moment in time, you're absolutely right. And that's
Yeah.
part of what led to this series. There's so many components that make up that heartbeat, and it can be different for various entities that are on the floor participating in the same moment in time. But for that moment in time, we are all united. Music is a universal language. I've danced and shared the floor and had that same community feeling with deaf people who feel the rhythm intrinsically within their body. And yes, there is a physiological response.
Yeah.
And, the joy of being able to get that total abandonment, to find that emotional release that maybe you can't find in your daily world, but you can find it completely surrounded by people, yet in total anonymity with yourself in the middle of the experience. I think anyone that's been there knows how cathartic it really can be, and you put your nail on the head, Tim.
Yeah. So that's all very true, Martha and
nail, whichever way.
Marsha, and one of the what came out of that eventually is I just started to kind of around that same time or shortly, I had quite a successful career in politics journalism, in television, and I got my dream job not that long afterwards, but also decided pretty much, a matter of weeks after I started my dream job, that what I really wanted to do was get out of political journalism, explore something that was more cultural, because Parliament, Westminster, UK politics at that time was somewhat depressing, and it felt like it wasn't really. It was, although I was and remain committed to political change at a parliamentary level, it felt a bit stuck, shall we say, and I began to wonder if there might be other avenues that I could immerse myself in, commit myself to, that would be more pleasurable and also more productive, like the results would be better, let's say. So I was kind of wanting to process the death of my parents. And my dad had come out of Nazi Germany on the Kindertransport trains that were organized by some of the Allied nations to get young Jewish boys and girls out of Nazi Germany.
I didn't know we had that in common. My parents also
Oh,
were
really?
Holocaust refugees from Vienna. They both left at different parts, but they knew each other in Vienna, and they reunited after the war quite by chance in New York. That's another story. But I didn't realize that we had that in common, Tim. I've known you for years.
Yeah, well, there you go.
It's an incredible bond and also an incredible perspective, because no matter how many times you hear that story, there are so many common threads throughout.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, so my dad came over to London as a 15-year-old boy, speaking no English, and his mum, my paternal grandma, and my dad's sister went to New York sometime later. I'm not quite sure how many months later they ended up managing to leave Germany. So my paternal grandma was living in New York. I always imagined Manhattan, of course, when I used to receive birthday checks from her through the post, which was always a very exciting moment. Dollars checks were very, very exotic. And getting a letter with the Statue of Liberty on it was also very exciting for a young kid. So New York had already long featured in my kind of sense of the world as a place which was important to me and that I might want to visit. It had obviously grown throughout my lifetime, and when I heard Louis Vega actually play at the Gardening Club, this spot that I mentioned to you, I was like, wow, this is, I really, it was it felt like such an important moment for me that I more or less resolved to go and live in New York City and be able to go and hear Louis DJ every week. All of this coincided with me becoming a bit tired of political journalism, and becoming also recognizing that I wanted to kind of explore things emotionally and, if you like, spiritually for myself following the death of my parents. My dad, I always thought this was an amazing story, had gone on to become an English teacher. He absolutely loved literature, English literature, as did my mum. And so I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do to reconnect with all of these things, to bring them all together. I'm going to go and move to New York, apply to do a doctorate in English literature at Columbia University. I'd get to study with my hero professor, Edward Said, who was a key figure in the development of post-colonial studies, but had written really interesting material on what he called, drawing on a bunch of other figures, intellectuals, including Gramsci, this idea of the public intellectual, someone who basically would be not so much a researcher or academic living in the kind of supposedly as ivory towers of academia, speaking only to other academics and researchers, but rather someone who was doing this research, but the research would be outward facing. It would try and engage with the general public and would try and change the world. And this appealed to me because I didn't really want to be a journalist, and I also didn't quite want to be an academic. I wanted to be something in the middle, if that makes sense. And I thought, yeah, let's go and do it in New York, because Edward Said was there, and I really admired his work a great deal. He was a bit of a hero for me. I had this long kind of connection in my heart to New York because of my grandma going there. I was now in love with the music that was coming out of New York. I thought that was the best house music that was being made at that particular moment.
What year are we talking about?
This was 19. I mean, I don't want to go through the whole history, obviously.
No,
but
just give me a year frame.
19. I'm just trying to think. 1994, the autumn of 94, I moved to New York.
Okay.
To do a doctorate in English literature at Columbia University, and to basically go dancing every Wednesday night.
And let me just tell our audience, little Louis Vega was no ingenue in the 90s. He was extremely well established. I first met him in my incarnation in the 70s in the music business, promoting records, et cetera, et cetera. He was very well established, had a wonderful following. To this day, a brilliant, iconic.
I don't know if he quite went back, did he? I don't know if he went back that far, but he was at Devil's Nest, and that maybe he was, but I don't know if he quite went back to the 70s. He
went back definitely into my earlier roots.
All right, okay.
You know,
I know he DJ'd at the venue that succeeded the Funhouse. Which was, I think, called the Devil's Nest, and initially he was a more of a Latin freestyle DJ, but then he got into house music. He formed this important friendship and partnership.
I just wanted to give a little bit of a timeline to your story, because it's different than, say, the timeline of Love Saves the Day or your Arthur Miller or Arthur
Russell.
I'm sorry, your Arthur Russell book or the other ones. I just want to give some perspective to our audience of the years you were talking about in New York. So early 90s.
Early 90s. Well, I arrived there, but Louis was, lots of things, things happened before, things have happened since. But, for that era, Louis Vega and Kenny Dope Gonzalez and Masters at Work were sort of at the top of their game, and they were the most sought after remixers in house music at that particular moment. They seemed to be, really at the cutting edge of innovation for, what was maybe a good 5 years between 1991 and maybe 1997, which is not to say they haven't done lots of amazing music since, but at that point it was like a magnetic gravitational pull for many people. You would hear, it was like there was a little bit of an echo of Larry Levan at the Paradise Garage. I mean, it's not to really try and compare the two. These comparisons are always flawed and fraught.
Agreed.
But people would go to the garage, of course, to hear Larry's latest remixes before they would actually get released. And that became a lot of people would go to the Sound Factory bar for the same reason.
Well, Tim,
so just to try and wrap this up, or you want to come in?
I think that you are correct in not making comparisons, not only because of styles of music and or locations, but also because of eras. Music and the dance industry was way different in the 90s than what we knew in the 70s and 80s from Levan and Garage days, or, I knew Frankie Knuckles from New York. The crux of his career is about his success in Chicago. So,
of course. I'm just talking about certain figures at certain moments, and I don't know, there might be lots and lots of them, but a couple stand out for me. certain figures in certain moments where they're not only DJing, but they're remixing. They are prolific remixers. The remixes are considered cutting edge, and if you want to go and hear those first, you go to the venue. But otherwise, that's the only parallel I'm trying to draw.
I understand, and I'm also looking at the parallel of heartbeats and how there are different heartbeats and how those transcend different periods in time.
Of course.
You know, what you were experiencing in the 90s. I mean, how is that different from what you had experienced in London up to coming to New York? And about how long were you in New York?
Well, I was just going to, I mean, maybe first, I can answer that, but let me first tie the original question up, which is why it's been going on. I've been going on a bit too long. I appreciate that. So apologies. But
no apologies.
I arrived wanting to do a doctorate in English literature and maybe bring in some other elements, maybe some film, maybe some music into that research. But early into arriving in New York, fairly early into arriving in New York, I had a friendly professor who was became a bit of a mentor, suggest I write a quick book about dance music history, and in particular house music and rave culture. Rave was about to be criminalized in the UK at that particular moment through the Criminal Justice Act, which was passed indeed in 1994, I'm pretty sure. So it was a big story, house music and the criminalization of rave culture. And I thought that would be a good thing to do on the side, if you like. I then so I started to research this book. I got a book contract to write it. And in the process, very early into the process of my research, a guy called Stephen Prescott, who was the co-running dance tracks with Joe Closell, that was a record store I was going to every Friday night, suggested I speak to David Mancuso, who was around somewhere towards the beginning of party culture and would be a useful person to speak with. I've told this story before. I didn't really want to speak with David particularly. I didn't want to go back to the 70s. I wasn't that drawn to the 70s. I was into electronic dance music. I wasn't that into disco. Disco was the music I'd hear on the radio as a kid growing up. I certainly wasn't too sure I wanted to go to pre-disco because that wasn't going to be the focus of what I was going to write about. But I met David. I was fascinated and in some respects spellbound by his story. He established a prehistory in the 3 hours we spoke together, of a prehistory of what we might as well call disco, which I don't think had been written about at all in any other book. There'd been passing references, maybe.
Tim, I don't even think it had been acknowledged before, to be honest with you. And let's face it, there would be no disco as we knew it if it wasn't for the precursors and that.
Exactly, it didn't come out of nowhere. So, and indeed, David had would acknowledge he had all his own precursors as well. This is the stuff of another interview, really. Though we'll see, stuff might also come up around David and the Loft.
Can I also interject?
But wearing my journalistic hat, I knew that this was, it was like the light bulb went on. It's like, wow, there's this whole.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I do want to keep our listeners up to speed. If they don't know who David Mancuso is, David Mancuso is probably most famous for what started out as a private party at his living space, and it turned into the Loft parties. And there's a whole lot of story and history on it. And I implore you to look it up. Tim's got some wonderful background on his website about David, and he is truly one of the icons. And
well, I'd say buy a book, quite frankly, rather than go on a website.
Just wanted to enlighten the listeners there, Tim.
Absolutely. Well, anyway, the story goes that it was clear that there was a whole prehistory of disco had not yet been written about what was going on downtown with all these private parties that mushroomed, and also public discotheques, and also that the story of disco, which up until then had revolved around telling stories about Studio 54 and the basement at Studio 54 and the door queues at Studio 54 and Bianca Jagger on the White Horse at Studio 54, and then a bit of Saturday Night Fever, and then a bit of Donna Summer, and then the Bee Gees, of course. So there was more to say.
Isn't that really what erupted our pop culture of today? I don't think People magazine would have blossomed the way it did if it wasn't for Studio 54 back then.
Well, I have to say this is not something that primarily interests me, although I did take an interest in writing about how Studio 54 emerged. It was clearly a cultural phenomenon. So all of this stuff, include all the stuff I do talk about in the first book in some detail, but the first book really was the first book to kind of provide a history of disco that began in 1970 and explored the roots of what came to be known as disco, with, in particular focusing on the influence of David Mancuso at the Loft that hadn't been properly recognized at all at that moment. So that was the kind of
none of that
pieces of Love Saves the Day. And in the end, the 70s became so fascinating to me, and David's story in particular, but also many other stories, because it was a movement, and it was a radical movement, both socially and sonically. This period became so fascinating to me that in the end I found myself that and this book, which was called Love Saves the Day, taking 500 pages or so just to cover the 1970s. I didn't get anywhere near house music, which is what the book was supposed to be about. So
you fell in love with us
and so, I mean, just to on the bio, I mean, we should be past this by now, but I mean, I've written a couple of other books and I've started started various other things, but in 2000, in the run up, well, I suppose around 2002, and then definitely happening in 2003, David approached Colleen Murphy and also myself to ask if we would like to start co-hosting Loft parties in London. So that's something that we started in June 2003. David passed away at the end of 2016, but the parties in London have continued, although not during the pandemic, of course. So this is another thing that, so it was very interesting to do this work, if you like, as a researcher, interviewing not only David, but at least 100 other people who were involved in, and then eventually for the 3 books, probably 300 people I must have interviewed, to find out what was going on in this incredible time and space of New York City in the 70s and early 1980s, in particular, I came to believe. But it's very interesting not to be just interviewing people. You get one set of perspectives, but then to actually organize and host the parties oneself gives one another a perspective. And let me segue. So working alongside David did become pretty interesting, I have to say, because he was everything in that room, as far as David would be concerned, was to maximize the energy and the joy on that dance floor. Everything was organized with that in mind. So it's very interesting.
Tim, I didn't mean to interrupt you before, but I wanted to get a little to the point of your perspective on what you feel makes the heartbeat of the dance floor, both from your experience being on it and your experience in later years with David and producing events. I know that's not really your wheelhouse, but if you could give us a little bit of insight into your perspectives on heartbeats, how they occur, how they become magical, and how they either change and or may remain the same, or what aspects of them. Please, thank you.
Sure. So I think there's both there is difference and variety in terms of what can make a dance floor come to life, for this energy that can exist between sound systems and dancers and music and DJs and environmental elements, including lighting, etc., can make them gel and explode and find expression in something that is joyous and cathartic. There is going to be difference in the way that people experience these things because of different geographical locations, different cultural experiences, different taste preferences, different ages, maybe different drugs that are being consumed, different musical preferences of different crowds, and the reasons for there's an infinite number of ways in which we can see that this kind of euphoria, this connectedness between people through music and dance, which I think you're calling the heartbeat, this can come together in a variety of ways. I could probably talk about 50 different settings and scenarios, which are quite varied and quite different, in which I've been in a dance situation or a musical situation where people have connected joyously and cathartically and ecstatically through music. So there's a lot of variety in these things, but there's also something I think which is quite similar in these experiences. And so we could talk for the next 20 years potentially about the differences, because there are so many of them, and maybe we'll return to some of the specificities because they can be really interesting. How do things work differently in New York than London? Maybe, although these are already kind of generalizations. But I'm kind of also interested in the things that unite these experiences, this thing which I think you're referring to as the heartbeat.
Yes.
And that is, I mean, if we start off by thinking about the heartbeat to begin with, it's life. It's an expression of life. The expression of that life is rhythmic, and it begins, and it's core, and it's organic. It's tied to the human body. It's also tied to being healthy. When we are in the womb, growing as babies before we are born, this is our it's our primary sonic experience, is to hear the heartbeat. And it's obviously it's reassuring. And it also, the interesting thing about the heartbeat is it provides structure. You know, as human beings, we like variety, we like unpredictability, we all these things, but we also often organize ourselves around structure. The other thing to be said about the experience of the unborn and then born child is that they're used to being in a contained space, a warm space, a comforting space that has some boundaries and that contains them and also nourishes them, because the baby is beginning, is basically being fed through the warm, hearing this sound. Sound is also the thing that existed at the beginning of the universe. This is the origins of the universe are the Big Bang. So the idea, and also sound, is a very interesting phenomenon. I wouldn't want to start saying it has godlike qualities, because I haven't really, about anything else, I haven't thought this through. But sound is omnipresent. It fills every space available, and it's omnidirectional. So wherever you are, you can't see everything with your eyes. Your eyes are very directional. Your eyes also create separation between you and the world. Your eyes tell you what is in front of you and that isn't inside of you. Sound doesn't work that way. Sound comes inside of us. We feel sound. We all know the kind of, the references to feeling your kind of, your stomach, feeling the bass in your stomach if you're on a dance floor as it comes through the floor. We know that's why bass bins are on the floor. So sound disrupts who we are as human beings. But it also enables us, by disrupting us as human beings, it enables us to kind of temporarily reduce our concern with our ego, our separation, and allows us to start to connect with other people. And this goes to the heart of the being of the universe, the being of existence, is it's through sound. And this is what we're talking about here, is we're talking the effect that sound can have on human beings.
Exactly.
Anthropology indicate early, the research into the earliest forms of human organization and community indicate that humans got together and so we know some of this stuff from cave paintings, for example. What were they drawing on cave paintings? The first paintings show people dancing. And one of the main theories as to why this came about is that if humans learned at an early point, and this is ancient history, of course, to combine together in groups, then they would be more likely to survive than if they remained separate. And the way they just formed their bonds within groups was through dancing and through music. And this is almost certainly pre-linguistic as well, pre what we would consider to be language.
No doubt.
This what you are calling the heartbeat, referring to my own work, it doesn't begin in 1970 in downtown New York, obviously. It doesn't begin with kind of rock and roll and the twist. It doesn't begin with jazz emerging in New Orleans. It doesn't begin with, the emergence in Africa of human beings putting animal skins on kind of structures in order to make drums. It goes back to the beginning of human civilization. It goes back millennia and millennia. And since then, humans have found ways to organize and get together in order to enter into this ritual that can bring them a sense of collectivity and communality and also joy. Barbara Ehrenreich has written a book that I read only this summer, which I thought was excellent, and it's a history of collective joy. What Ehrenreich notes is that from the birth of Christ onwards, and certainly from the formation and establishment of Christianity as an organized religion, gradually these expressions of collective joy got to be erased from society, and they got to be repressed and controlled and channeled through the institution of the church. And this, in particular, Protestantism was kind of responsible for this. But from the late night, and I realize I'm racing through history here.
No, it's fascinating, Tim.
During the 1960s, and in particular the latter 1960s, this version of history and the organization of society, which in particular took root in post-war America, 1950s America, one of the most repressive decades in US history, when everything was supposed to be organized around the 9 to 5 at work, the housewife staying at home, the housewife bound to the kitchen and the laundry room, the kids being well behaved, barbecues in the back garden, and heterosexuality being mandatory, and America basically meaning white America and straight America. This was disrupted as civil rights gained momentum in the 1950s and going through the 1960s, as gay liberation broke through in the 1960s, and in particular towards the end of that decade, as we know with Stonewall, as Black Power began to kind of further challenge the institution of whiteness and white privilege within America, as the feminist movement started to gain momentum, as the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War started to challenge US colonialism, as a whole generation of young people in particular, but not only young people, decided that they wanted to think about different ways that they could live their life and organize their society, and sometimes took a nice dose of LSD in the process in order to explore.
You're talking about my generation.
Exactly. I'm talking about your generation, and I came a little bit after it. Exactly. And there was a desire to find new ways to experience life, to experience work, to experience pleasure. And a lot of these energies came to be repressed during the very late 1960s. There were assassinations, there were infiltrations of Black nationalist organizations. There was there was no immediate passing of rights for gay men and lesbian women, and bisexuals and transsexuals. There was a repression of the anti-war movement. LSD was made illegal, and a lot of these energies, instead of disappearing, found a different form of expression, and they found it on the dance floor, and it was the downtown New York dance floor. And it kind of happened in New York because it was the most, it was an advanced industrial city, in very general terms. It was the major cultural center in the Western world, even if it was going through economic hardship. It was going through significant changes economically. So the ex-industrial base, if you like, the downtown lofts were beginning to empty out of industry. So spaces opened up in which artists and musicians and people like David Mancuso could live and explore new ways of expression. And it also, partly thanks to its history of migration, and its emergence as one of the gay capitals of the Western world, if not the most important gay capital of the Western world. It had the most diverse population on the planet in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, sex, sexuality, and class. It was primarily a working class city, in fact, in those days. So New York was able to bring these mix of energies, these countercultural energies, these voices from the margins, women, queers, people of color who had been excluded from society, and gave them a new space in which to express themselves. And the way that these groups had experienced oppression through their bodies. Their bodies were being controlled by society. Queers were not allowed to have sex with each other. It was forbidden. Black people and brown people were discriminated against because of the color of the skin on their bodies, and their whole lives could become repressed, or in many ways were repressed because of their bodies. Women were controlled through their bodies, and were told they needed to stay at home, or that they wouldn't get equal rights at work, or etc. etc. So these groups had experienced physical bodily repression, and they wanted to find a way of expressing themselves and organizing socially in which they could experience bodily freedom. And this became the dance floor. And this is also why disco, when it eventually emerged properly in 1974, was in many respects the sound of a countercultural coalition. It was a sound that represented the values and the aesthetic preferences of people of color, of queers, and of women, because these were the people who were going on the dance floors where that sound was forged. Disco was the first sound that really grew out directly from the dance floor and nowhere else. But the basic properties that enabled these people to come together and dance, even if there would be differences, even if differences emerged in, let's say, the white gay scene versus, you know, the Loft scene that eventually gave birth to the Paradise Garage, etc. Yeah, there was still, we can talk about the differences, but the commonalities are really interesting. And the commonalities are, you have a comfortable space, yeah, where people feel safe. They don't feel that they're kind of in danger.
Very important. Agreed.
The sound is arranged in a way that means that people can enjoy the music. There's a lot of attention is paid to that. That also means that your space needs to have decent acoustics, because acoustics, I forget what the percentage is that's often given to this, but I don't know if it's as much as 90% of the sound is down to a room's acoustics. Have a fantastic sound system, but if you're in a horrible acoustic space, you'll sound horrible. And then it's about the music, and the music is about not so much like one style of, let's say, dance music, to use a generic description, is better than another style of dance music. It's what is the issue is, the concern is always, what is the communication like between the person selecting the music and the people who are dancing? And all that matters is that there's a communication. And if there's a communication, it will work. That's the heartbeat. It's about connection. It's about the way that sound connects bodies to sound, and it connects bodies to bodies. And the DJ as a culture worked because it was a way of connecting the music to the desires of a dance floor. And the DJs who emerged, who were the best DJs, who were the most successful DJs, weren't the people who were the best looking. They weren't necessarily the people who were the best technicians. They weren't the people who were the best connected. They were the people who could act as, could respond as kind of sensory, you know, sensory agents, if you like, and detect what the mood on the floor was, and could both encourage and lead that energy into places that maybe wasn't being expected, but above all could respond to it and find that balance and go on a journey that was, you know, and this is what we call antiphony or call and response. And we see it in many other different musical situations, including kind of, you know, the black church, where the preacher shouts out one thing, the congregation replies, and you generate a song. It's a conversation through music. And in a way, that's all DJing is. It's about establishing the conversation. And the only thing that matters for that dance floor, for this heartbeat, this communication, this connection to exist, is that the communication is allowed to flow. The DJ who just wants to dictate, go off on his or her own trip, is not going to be a dance floor that produces euphoria. And that also, you know, a DJ who also doesn't, you know, who also doesn't ever know how to lead is probably also not going to generate a certain amount of it, because part of the excitement is also introducing new music or taking or thinking what music that crowd might want to hear that they haven't heard before. Anyway, it's all about the connection.
Yes,
to sound and to other people through these selections of the DJ.
And to your point, as the patrons of the venue, they know when they're listening to particular DJ X, Y, or Z that does have that interaction and that communication, which I agree is totally vital. And I'm so glad you brought that aspect up. But that allows for a greater level of trust, not only in the safe venue that you're at, but you're now trusting the entirety of your musical journey in the hands of your Pied Piper, if you will. And it's a total trusting environment, and that is something that is earned over time, and that is because of the communication. And I'm so glad you brought up this perspective on the heartbeat, because you really nailed it. That is what it's about. And it's that symbiotic relationship. It is that give and take, and that is what sets not only DJs but events and gatherings sometimes a notch above your regular.
Yeah, then there's other. Thank you. Then there's other. There's other things that influence it. You can say that lighting is important, and of course, lighting is important. Can be important. Even David in his what was the very basic setup in terms of lighting at the beginning of the Loft introduced some lighting.
Yes.
Nicky Siano would say how there would be a kind of little lampshade, and it would go on and off at key moments in the party. Very, very. We just know from theatrical situations that it's often the simplest effects can be the most forceful. In fact, it was David who brought back the mirror ball as something that was going to be used on the dance floor. I think it had enjoyed its popularity. I'm not sure if it was first during the 1920s or the 1930s, the first craze of the mirror ball. But David reintroduced the mirror ball onto the dance floor. There hadn't been mirror balls on 1960s dance floors, as far as I'm aware. But David understood the beautiful potential. I mean, the mirror ball is extraordinary. It's not very expensive. All you need to do is put one light on it, and it transforms a room into, as we all know, this
it's magical. It is
magical spinning that is full of infinite potential, and it's geometric connections, and it just enables you to as does the music, as does the dance, as to whatever it might be, all sorts of elements, enables you to enter into a different mode of being, a different state of being.
Most efficient and effective, simplest effects you ever can do. And whether you do it with a 3-sided prism and a light, or you do it with a fantabulous mirror ball that's got gazillions of etches on it, it's like stars in the room. And to your point, even though I didn't get to New York in the mid-70s, and the mirror ball, of course, was quite obvious, I do remember going into Roseland Ballroom when it was still, at that time, it was like $1 a dance thing, just because I had to see it. And they had a very huge mirror ball, and I'm sure that had been there since the 30s or 40s when they
maybe. But I'm talking as an icon.
No, I know what I get.
Something that was being used specifically for that purpose. Yeah, I'm not trying to suggest
David
that
is not credited with a lot of what he did back then, and he and a handful of others, as you say, created this wonderful underground movement that grew into clubs that people do know, like the Paradise Garage or 12 West or Fire Island clubs or whatever. And then they went down the more commercial venture, as you well noted, after the mid-70s.
Well, it's variety again, as I said, is infinite variety. The Loft remained true to itself. The Garage remained true to this, this core aesthetic where everything is organized around that dance floor experience, and maximizing the ability of people to listen to music, to dance comfortably, to connect with each other, and to then go with the flow of the musical journey. I mean, one contrast that this is easy. This is what I did in Love Saves the Day, but we could talk about it today as well. Is what happens when there's too much lighting. Now, too much is a value judgment. Because some people want more, there might not be too much for some people. Some people might love the lights more than the sound, for example. That might be the main thing that they're drawn to. To me, if we were to look at Studio 54, and I think about the interviews I've conducted, and it's not to knock Studio 54, but I haven't heard one person who went to, say, the Loft or the Gallery or the Paradise Garage or Flamingo or 12 West. I haven't heard one person who went to any of those venues say that when they went to the Studio 54, they thought there was, let's, in your terms, Marsha, say there was a better heartbeat. I haven't heard one person say that.
I think that we're qualifying better or worse, and we're mixing private with, Studio 54 was not a private club, although.
Well, that's another element, so we could talk about that as well.
There's so many.
But the reasons were given were somewhat different. I mean, there's lots of things with Studio. Okay, so one thing I'd say about Studio.
Hang on, let me finish. I'm not trying to knock your point or Studio. I'm merely trying to say that the theatricality that Studio, that Xenon, that those larger clubs embodied in their construction and their desire to attract the audiences of the late 70s, of the early 80s. The Palladium that I worked in 1985, that was nowhere. Now, I worked at the Palladium, and I also was on the installation crew that put the new light system up at the garage in 1980. In 1980, we put up rings with a bunch of pin spots and par cans. In 1985, the Palladium had robotic lighting fixtures. So I think that each had its own element. And I think, to your point, to get back to the lighting, I think that anything can be too excessive or not enough. It's very hard to find that perfect point in the middle. And that goes for just about all aspects, I think. And in lighting, I hate it when everything is on all at once, because then you can't recognize anything.
Yeah, the thing I was going to say about Studio is, sure, absolutely. I mean, I think I suppose the point I would make, I mean, with, the venues you talked about, Palladium and everything, I mean, there's a lot of elements that to think through, and it's very hard to do to be exhaustive in a short space of time and all of that. But one of the things that a number of people mentioned to me about Studio, just to try and stay with one thing at a time, is that they said that at Studio it was more about looking than hearing. There was more focus on the visuals than on the sound. And to me, and this is to me, but I think that this can, when you get to a situation where there is more emphasis on the visuals, you are probably less likely to create a euphoric, interconnected energy on the dance floor.
You have
That's
just
more that I'm trying to not be absolute about this, but I would say that there's an inverse relationship between these things.
You've made an excellent point, and using Studio as the example to continue with your point, it's a very excellent point, and it illustrates how on different nights of the week, Studio 54 was a different environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Heartbeat. And if you went on a Wednesday, or if you went on a Friday or a Saturday, it was absolutely what you were talking about. However, it drew a different audience on a Thursday or on a Sunday. And then you felt a different heartbeat. So you had different heartbeats within the same venue, as opposed to...
Absolutely. And exactly the same happened after Steve Rebell and Ian Schrager went to jail, and Studio 54 was temporarily run initially by, Mike Stone, and then Jim Forak came in a little bit later as well, with Rudolph Pfeiffer. But when Mike Stone came in, he basically, Mike Stone had kind of run a private party called Soho Place with Richard Long, who went on to organize the sound at the Paradise Garage, of course, with Larry Levan inputting significantly. So Mike Stone, and he was a regular at the Loft. So Mike Stone came from this downtown multicultural, cosmopolitan, polysexual private party scene, and then around the beginning of 1980 or the middle of 1980, suddenly got to bring his crowd and his DJs into Studio 54. And yes, again, it was a very different party experience. So this is significant. But then part of the thing is, and one of the reasons it became more engaging was because there was less emphasis on, are there any celebrities in here? And who are the celebrities? Because if you're always looking around wondering where the celebrity is, you're not actually letting yourself go and be absorbed into the musical situation.
Exactly.
And the thing about lights is lights can enhance that musical situation and experience, but at the point where they start to interfere with it and become the thing itself and become more important than, say, the sonic experience, they try and take over, then I think you lose something, because it's a sound that is core to the connectivity, and people basically letting go of themselves in order to join the crowd, the collective feeling.
And you have now touched upon one of the important points of what I hope to bring to the table with this series, is that there are many different elements that will combine to create the heartbeat of the dance floor, and or lack thereof. and you can have all of those elements converging together, or as the example you've just chosen, the music could be good, the music could even be great, but if the lighting or the atmosphere or some other element is detracting from it, then it negatively impacts on the experience of that particular evening and that particular moment. So maybe there's a very faint heartbeat as opposed to an outstandingly strong one when you've got that symbiotic energy that can occur between the visual technicians and the musical creators, like a person who's setting up your musical journey. If you're on the same page with that person and your job is to create the lighting journey that goes along with it, you're working in tandem as a duet. You're enhancing each other's performance as opposed to going in there and creating a fabulous light show just because you can. And I think that detracts from that ultimate perfection we look for, that magic that I say, in the heartbeat. You've brought up so many amazing points. Your perspective is outstanding, Tim. I would love to have you back. I would love to pick up another segment with you. I'd love to explore a little bit more about what you're doing today and some of your current parties and your podcast. But if before we say goodbye, you would please just briefly fill us in on what you're up to, where we can find you. We're going to add tags and hashtags and where we can find you on social media. We're going to go ahead and try to find you as much as possible in so many avenues that you're in. But tell us a little bit about your new podcast. Honestly, I listened to one the other day and I thought it was just fabulous. Your love saves the message. So give us a little fill in on where we can find you and what you're doing. And we look forward to having you back to discuss the 80s and the 90s.
Oh yeah, that'll be great. Well, I'm just, I'm working on a new book, so that's kind of taking up quite a lot of my focus right now. I'm involved with.
Tell us anything about it.
Well, it's going to be it's going to dive a lot deeper into the David Mancuso and the Loft. I always thought that Love Saves the Day was a history of 1970s party and dance music culture that made an argument for David Mancuso and the Loft's central contribution, but also took into account a multitude of other party spaces and elements that went into making that decade what it became. The current book is. Yeah, there's reasons for this, but I think that since Love Saves the Day came out, people have kind of sort of accepted the argument that at the beginning of this culture, there was basically David Mancuso. And I think we can also say Francis Grasso, but Francis's career was more or less over within a year and a half, and he didn't go on.
Well, that may be, but you do speak about a point in New York history where you had two cultures doing similar, if not the same thing, simultaneous. And to tell everybody, Francis Grasso was most notable for his work at the Sanctuary, which at the time was predominantly gay and a precursor to the private club Flamingo and then 12 West. Whereas David Mancuso and the Loft were precursors to the Garage, Paradise Garage. And all of them lived symbiotically and with each other collectively in this wonderful environment that was New York City in the 70s. Boy, it was heavenly, I'll tell you.
Yeah, I mean, with the Sanctuary, there was one of the significant things about the Sanctuary was it took off it was a failing discotheque, and it kind of took off when two entrepreneurs who owned a bunch of bars in the village called Seymour and Shelley took over that spot, and it became the first public discotheque to openly admit gay men and lesbian women, bisexuals, transgender, and the widest variety of people. Everyone I spoke to who went to dance at the Sanctuary thought that it was a mixed dance floor. No one ever thought that it was an exclusively gay dance floor. It wasn't how New York was configured at that time. People have a slight tendency to think about the way that, in some respects, for example, gay culture did become quite segmented during the 1970s, quite homogeneous in some respects. If you went to somewhere like Flamingo in particular, you would see one, almost arguably one type of gay man on that dance floor. and that was what that party. It was like, it was really a tribe. It really was a tribe. The Sanctuary was not like that, and also nor was the Loft. The Loft was probably a bit more multicultural than the Sanctuary, but both places were open to everyone. And New York was a very, very diverse, had a very diverse population at the time, and lots of different people wanted to go out and party. And it came out of this coalition that I spoke about before. So yeah, anyway, the new book is kind of, just rather than situating the Loft within, let's say, within the context of the story of the 1970s, it's trying to see it more in terms of its own organic development. And so it's digging a lot deeper into David's upbringing and his early time in New York City. It goes a lot deeper into the 70s, and it's going to be taking the story much further as well, because the last book, Life and Death on the New York Dance Floor, ended in 83. The Loft is still going. I mean, there's a kind of, I don't want to go on, but I think it was David Mancuso's passing in November 2016. The way that his parties did start to become recognized as arguably a year zero, because whatever happened at the Sanctuary, David, when he started the parties that came to be known as the Loft, he was very clear that he wanted to establish the dance floor as a utopian space, and nobody had done that before. And Francis Grasso didn't do that. And I don't believe Seymour and Shelley did that, not for 1 second. The person who said, and David had very specific reasons for doing this. The dance floor had existed as a social space, as a space where you could meet people from the opposite sex, a space where you could have a good time, but it wasn't established as a place where you could begin to build a utopia. This was David's art. This was his experience and his vision. And I think this is what we now understand it as. This is what we often think of. We haven't really talked about this, but this is, that it is utopia when all of our heartbeats are aligned, when we all start beating that same beat, when we recognize our commonality, and we can express joy to be thankful for our existence on this planet, and the beauty of that through especially dance and music. So this is, that's kind of why I talk about it. I think, the other thing about David is it was unwavering. He had this idea. It sort of came into fruition really very early on. He'd just done a few parties previously. I mean, a number, but not concerted. It came together in February 1970, and then it didn't change fundamentally for 50 years. This is like a biblical prophet. You lay down the law, and you do not waver. You are rigorous. And there's something fascinating about that. There's something prophetic about that. And I just felt that, given if there was a prophetic vision going on here, we need to acknowledge that and give it its space to understand it. And then the other thing is the Loft, has carried on in New York City and London, not during the pandemic, of course, and also in Japan. And so, it turned 50. I guess it must have been in 2020. I think the 50th anniversary might have even been almost certainly was the last New York City Loft party before the pandemic closed so much down. So that 50th anniversary also just sort of seems to call out for, there's something very unusual going on here, very unusual for a party to be running 50 years, including in 3 geographical locations after the founder has died. So, and I thought I might be a bit bored when I started writing this book, because I thought, well, maybe I know everything about this there is to know, and it's just going to be a matter of writing it, but it's not but I'm just finding it absolutely fascinating. Anyway, so sorry, that was very long, and I'm sure this will all be cut, but that's fine. But I'm also the podcast I've started more recently with my good friend and colleague, and also co-host of these parties, or one of the co-hosts of these parties, Jeremy Gilbert, and it's called Love is the Message, not Love Saves the Message. Love is the Message. That's okay. And it's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Patreon, and those are some of the, and we're waiting to get parties going again in London. I co-host Lucky Cloud Sound System, which is the party started with David Mancuso and others back in 2003. And we have a party coming up on the 3rd of October, which is going to be interesting to get going again. I think there's a lot of desire for people to return to the dance floor, even if it's complicated. And some people have some reservations. It's a complicated world we live in right now. It's difficult to navigate it. And the other party I started called All Our Friends, which I also DJ at. We're waiting to see when we'll be able to get going again. That's not so clear cut, but I do co-host and indeed even DJ now, and it's been interesting to explore that whole terrain, what it means to pick music in this conversational environment and how it can
Not
work.
as easy as it looks, is it?
It's not as easy as it looks. But the funny thing is, I always thought it would be like the most boring thing to do, or I didn't want to do it, or it'd be stressful. And in the end, you know, there came a situation where, and I hadn't felt this for my entire life, but I felt like there was something I wanted to say that I thought, and a way I wanted to connect that I wanted to try out. And when I got that feeling, I thought, you know, I couldn't quite shake it. And before then, I was just the dancer and secondarily maybe the writer. You know, I just wanted to be on that dance floor. Now, well, I also love the situation because there's 3 of us do it. So you get to have a good dance, and then you get to put on a few records, and then you get to have a good dance. So it's quite an interesting situation. But anyway, that's another story.
I hope to be able to travel to the UK and experience this firsthand one day. It would be
that would be amazing if you could join us in
London. I'm chomping at the bit to be able to travel. These days, I'm kind of erring on the side of caution, but I'm grateful to have the internet. I'm grateful to have people like you in my life that help me present this project, because this kind of came out of a lot of what you were talking about, a way to not let certain memories and certain things that impact people today that they have no idea how or why or whence it came from. And that's a little bit of what we're trying to do. And with our little podcast, and Tim, I must say you have added so much to what I thought a broad definition of what a heartbeat could be, and write down your basic statements about David and what drives you to the book and to write the book about him. I think that in and of itself exemplifies what I'm trying to accomplish in this series, which is to illustrate how heartbeats come in many different shapes and sizes. No two are the same. They're all unique, but they all have the same overall positive impact on those people that are there experiencing that at the time.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I'm just going to throw in, you know, there was one of the interviews I did with David. It was a bit of a jokey interview. It was for some magazine, and I had to pretend I didn't know David, and I had to imagine that the readers reading the interview wouldn't know who David was either. So I just started off by asking him, so David, what do you do if you want to, you know, when you organize a party? So I think this goes to the heart of the question, by the way. And he said, okay, the first thing, you want a group of friends who want to put on a party together, who want to dance together, listen to music and dance together. That's the first thing. If you haven't got that, you don't get started. Don't bother. Because otherwise, what is it? It's an abstract idea. It's a commercial venture. The key thing is to begin with the social interaction, friendship, friends wanting to be together and enjoy music. Then you find a good space that is comfortable, it's warm, it's got good acoustics. Then you put together some sort of sound, and it doesn't have to be all like the most amazing sound equipment. The better you can, the more of the emphasis is on the music, the better. You want to hear the music, because it's the music that will give you the energy. Then you might sort of, send out some invites to friends and friends of friends. Then you decorate the place a little bit, you know, some lights, some balloons, whatever it might be. On the day of the party, you get some food together. David said to me, the last thing you think about is the DJ. That's the last thing. And I'm not saying that that's the way that we always have to think about it now, but it was very interesting because most people, when they think about putting on a party, they're kind of, or think about the culture, their first thought is the DJ. But the DJ in many respects is the least important figure. The DJ just comes along to be in that situation and to put on music that people want to dance to. It's not an ego thing. It's not a superstar thing. It's not a big performance thing necessarily. If everyone is facing the DJ, no one is dancing with each other. You may as well be at a rock concert, and there's nothing wrong with a rock concert or a sporting event, but it's different. It's not about the interaction of the crowd.
Well, I don't know if you've been to any fest of the more EDM festivals. I've attended a number of ultra fests in Florida, and I can tell you that being on a dance floor of 20 of my tribe is far more intimate and far more communal and expressive, and I'm interacting with the people that I'm with, and we're having a shared experience far more than being on the field with 20,000 people that are all on their phones recording and facing the DJ and not interacting and creating a social what I call the heartbeat, but it is exactly that. It is an energy. It's an energy that is generated and sustained by those people creating that energy, and those are the participants in the experience. And when you're standing and watching, you're not participating.
Absolutely, especially if you've got your phone up whilst you're kind of. I couldn't agree more. And so I think, look, we live in a society that's obsessed by spectacle. It's obsessed with celebrity. Is obsessed with kind of instantaneous streaming and all the rest of it. And there's nothing innately wrong with any of these things. But when a music culture gets to be organized around these things, there are some losses. And sometimes, the people who are in these, I mean, I'm sure that everyone has a good time or a pretty good time that goes to these events, but I go back to the anecdote, that compares Studio 54 and the Loft. Lots of people went to Studio 54, which was more about spectacle, and loved it, let's say, had a great time. But when they went to the Loft or the Paradise Garage or the Saint or wherever, it was a qualitatively different experience, because in those venues, everything was geared up around the kind of dance floor experience and the interaction between the dancers. It's about also, giving people the opportunity to have different experiences that can actually, are maybe less spectacular, but maybe, more profound. Well, and on the phones, absolutely. I mean, in the parties that, basically the Loft and its incarnations and its offshoots in London, certainly this party I run called All Our Friends Now, it's no phones on the dance floor. We don't make people give their phones in when they enter because it's all a bit complicated and a bit oppressive and stuff. But we make it clear that people want to use their phones, they should leave the dance floor, because there's nothing worse than a person being on the dance floor looking at texting their friend when they're on the dance floor, because the entire group of people,
they're not participating.
They're not there in time and space. They're not there in real time and space.
I feel the same way about drinks on the dance floor. If you want to go drink, go to the refreshment area, talk to your friends. That's what it's there for. The dance floor is for dancing in our tribal community. And Tim, I could go on and on with you. I do hope we do a segment 2. I do want to continue after you get the David Mancuso book out. And if there's any way we could do an interaction with one of your Loft parties and maybe illustrate that,
Well, that's exactly what we wouldn't allow.
I realize that.
It's there in real time.
And honestly,
Tim, no filming.
Honestly, Tim, if most of our audience had, unfortunately, we were privy to, or at least certainly I was privy to attending some of these events that we talk about, and of all of the percentages of people that went out and experienced the dance music culture in clubs in general, I would wager maybe 2% of them in New York ever got to these venues that you and I are talking about. And one of the reasons was they were private clubs. So you went at the invitation of a member who was your friend, or you yourself were a member. And that's a whole different scene. So when we're describing our heartbeat, it was prevalent and predominant in those venues because that's where it was created. When you went to the other more commercial venues, it was there. Sometimes it was there in varying degrees. It wasn't that it didn't exist. It was different. And it's those differences that we hope to explore in this series. Tim, it has been an absolute delight. I know that you've got places to be and a busy schedule, and I would look forward to inviting you back for a part 2. Even if the David book is not finished yet, we'd love to have you back. We'd love to have your stories and your insights. And it has been a delight being able to call you my friend for these many years.
It's been a pleasure too, Marsha. Thanks very much indeed. Good luck with everything.